This presentation is about the different phenomena that occur in the universe and trying to understand their nature, the nature of emergence, the nature of causality, and how all of these things are intertwined. So what you see on the screen in front of you is the standard model of particle physics. So as far as we could tell, these are the most fundamental constituents of reality. There could be smaller constituents. For example, string theorists posit the existence of string, which in theory would be smaller than these particles and would be the most fundamental layer of reality, but that hasn't been confirmed yet. And so as far as we can tell, these are the smallest units of reality. And everything appears to be composed out of these fundamental constituents. Now, you can take these constituents and organize them in different ways to get new entities. So, for example, if you take two of these up quarks and one of these down quarks, you can get a proton, which has a positive charge. Now, the proton itself can then become a smaller unit in a bigger substructure known as an atom. Where you take several protons, several neutrons, and electrons, and now you have an atom. And different combinations of protons, neutrons, and electrons, different quantities of them, will give you all of the various elements on the periodic table. So each of these atoms is composed of a different combination of neutrons, protons, and electrons. And so just with these very small constituents, you're already getting a wide range of different elements. But these elements themselves can become the constituents of larger structures, namely molecules. So these are some simple organic molecules, organic in the sense that they're composed of carbon and hydrogen, and they're relatively simple, but you can see how you can take different atoms and combine them in sophisticated ways to get longer chains and more sophisticated structures. And so it just kind of takes off from there with the number of different molecules that you can get. Now, one of the most amazing and remarkable molecules we've ever discovered is that of DNA. Now, DNA is very interesting because it encodes information. It encodes information about the structure of these things, which are known as proteins. So these are your biomolecules, and proteins have a wide range of different properties. The main thing that proteins do in living systems is to catalyze certain chemical reactions. And so by catalyzing these reactions, they build bigger structures. So they're actually molecules that are capable of creating other molecules that are larger and more sophisticated. And proteins doing this can lead you to something like a cell. So a cell is an extremely complicated system involving a huge number of molecules that are each playing a specific role within the cell to maintain its integrity and carry out various functions, such as producing energy or storing the genetic material, as well as like maintaining the integrity of the whole thing. And so what we have here is something that's alive. We have an example of a living thing, and its fundamental constituents are not alive. So like these ribosomes and lysosomes and the nucleus and the DNA, none of these are alive in and of themselves, but you arrange them in a certain way such that they all partake in this structure, and now suddenly you have something that's alive. And now the cells themselves can become the units of bigger structures. So what we see here are some simple multicellular organisms composed of a few hundred cells, but you can see how the cells themselves can become the units for an entire organism. And this can get rather complicated because we have these simple microorganisms that are composed of millions of cells, and different cells can then specialize to perform different functions within the organism. And so we have different types of tissue developing to have their own properties and play different roles within the physiology of this organism. Now, when it comes to life, there's a staggering diversity and variety of living things that exist on this planet. It's mind-blowing when you think about the various different forms of life that exist on our planet and how different they are from each other, the unique properties, the unique abilities that they have, the unique sensory experiences that they have, the unique niches they occupy in nature. And so it's rather staggering, the number of organisms that exist on our planet and how diverse they are. But then these organisms themselves can become units in bigger structures. So if we think about humans and an individual human being an organism, We can take a collection of humans and with them create something like a society or a nation. And so many humans together creates a new thing known as a society. And then emergence can occur on different scales as well. So we've been talking about emergence going up, but within our own bodies, our own nervous systems are composed of trillions of neuronal cells that are wired together in very complicated ways. And this is another example of emergence, because all of these cells working together and working in tandem with each other and fulfilling different functions gives us things like our conscious experience, the qualia we experience, things like our abstract concepts and imagination that all take place within our mental architecture. So all of these neurons working together gives us something brand new in the form of conscious experience, in the form of sentience, and the fact that you can perceive the external world through qualia, through sensations like color and taste and hearing. And so these kind of new phenomena appear to be arising in the universe. But then we also want to talk about other phenomena. For example, something like economics. What kind of an entity is economics? Because it involves value, and it involves us imposing value upon these objects called money, called currency, and so a kind of new phenomenon is arising in the context of humans engaging in exchanging for goods and services, and creating this thing called money to facilitate exchange. And so a brand new thing has come into being because of the way humans interact with each other. But then what about something like language? Language is a very interesting phenomenon because it involves vibrating the air in front of me in order to produce meaning. What is meaning? How is it possible that sound can convey meaning in such a specific way, such that you understand what I'm saying? And not just that, but the fact that we have written language, so I can create these scribbles, and for some reason, when you look at these scribbles, it produces meaning inside your own mind. What's that all about? What kind of a phenomenon is that? But then what about something like science? So science is how humans understand the world. It's a tool that we use to gain information about the world, but it's also an activity. It's something that we partake in. So what kind of an activity or what kind of a phenomenon is science, such that humans with their intelligence are able to carry it out? And what about technology? What about the various forms of technology that we create? Some of the most sophisticated being our computers and, the microarchitecture of our computers, how stunningly complicated it can be, and, what our computers are even capable of, vast feats of computation in the blink of an eye. And so what kind of phenomena is this? And what kind of phenomena is the technology that we produce and the computational technology that we produce? So what we've been doing is showing how you can start with the most fundamental layer of reality and build your way up to more complicated phenomena. So these phenomena appear to arise from fundamental physics. Now, this is the question that we want to ask. Would you be able to predict the behavior of these higher level systems, whether it's a computer or technology or human behavior or, sociology, music, language, whatever? Would you be able to predict the behavior of these systems just from using the dynamics at the lower level? So this is the idea of physicalism or physical reductionism, i.e., every phenomenon can be reduced to fundamental physics. So no matter how complicated something like language appears to be, you should be able to understand language in its entirety just by referring to fundamental physics and the dynamics taking place at that lowest level of reality, according to this idea. Now, apparent higher level entities and phenomena are said to be weakly emergent. By weak emergence, we mean that these phenomena appear novel, but in principle, you should be able to just figure out how these systems will behave just by looking at the fundamental particles, and that's sufficient. So the information regarding the particles is sufficient. So what do I mean by that? Well, we have these fundamental particles, and we know that everything is made out of these particles. And then there's this equation known as the standard model Lagrangian, which is rather complicated in its full form, but in principle, it should be entirely deterministic. And this equation tells you how every particle will move. So if you have the initial conditions of every particle and you input that information into this equation, you should be able to know how those particles will behave into the future. And you can imagine doing this for every single particle in the universe and every single particle that your body is composed of. And that should be able to tell you how your body is going to behave. And that should be sufficient. Even though this idea of weak emergence exists, what I'm going to argue in this presentation is that you cannot, even in principle, predict certain systems entirely from lower level laws. And we regard such systems as strongly emergent. So in contrast to weak emergence, where it is predictable in principle, strongly emergent phenomena are not predictable just from the lower level laws. Now, how can this happen? How is this even possible? Well, generally, a phenomenon is strongly emergent if it occupies its own domain of knowledge, i.e., it involves new concepts which don't appear at the lower level. And these new concepts mean that an entirely mechanistic or physicalist view of the system is insufficient for understanding the whole, because there are brand new concepts and brand new principles or phenomena that take place at higher levels, which are not accounted for at lower levels. And so you can't actually carry out your calculation without accounting for these higher levels. Now, you might be thinking, isn't it possible that these higher level concepts are just ways for our minds to simplify highly complicated math? So, for example, we come up with theories of biology, of natural selection, for example. And, that's just a simplified way to represent the standard model Lagrangian. Like, it's just a way to make these things more understandable, because if we were to actually do the math for every single particle, the calculations would just become astronomical and enormous. And so just to simplify things, we come up with these other theories. But in principle, you should still be able to use the fundamental laws. Well, any phenomenon where this is true is a weakly emergent phenomenon, okay? And there's no problem with that. But in cases of strong emergence, this is not possible, because higher level concepts can be shown to have a downward causal effect on lower level laws. Okay, so you need information from the higher level domain to create a theory which can be used to compute the behavior of that system. This means that there's nothing magical about strong emergence. It might sound like there's something magical going on here, but really all that's happening is that when a higher level phenomenon emerges, it has brand new properties. And these properties can affect the lower level laws and the lower level fundamental constituents, such that the raw math which you use to compute the behavior of the fundamental constituents no longer applies. You need to account for new laws. And that's really all that's happening. It just means that the holistic system has causal efficacy. And this causal efficacy can sometimes occur in a downward fashion upon the fundamental constituents. So what we're showing here is how a low-level domain, so for instance, the fundamental particles, can give rise to a higher-level domain. So for example, particles giving rise to an atom. And then what we're saying is that it's possible for this higher level domain to have new properties that can influence its own constituents. Okay? So a phenomenon that arises from a lower level domain but has no causal influence on that lower level domain is just weakly emergent. So that's this case. But once that higher level domain has some kind of an influence over its fundamental constituents, we now have a strongly emergent phenomenon, because there's no way to use the basic math to figure out how that phenomenon is going to behave. So when a strongly emergent phenomenon comes into existence, its evolution from that point on will not be predictable from lower level laws, because new higher level laws apply to the way it behaves. And these simply do not exist at a lower level. So I'm going to quote George Ellis, who's done a lot of work to elucidate the concept of strong emergence and to prove that it is a real concept. He says, "We can say that a high-level phenomenon is strongly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomenon arises from the low-level domain, but truths concerning that phenomenon are not deducible, even in principle, from truths in the low-level domain. In strong emergence, properties are only deducible from lower level properties when you add concepts or variables that are derived from our knowledge of the nature of the higher level emergent domain. The lower level simply does not by itself imply the relevant higher level concepts or variables. One needs empirical input from the higher level theory to determine such bridge laws. So what this is essentially saying is that once a strongly emergent phenomenon exists, so it has these new properties, you need to observe those properties in order to know what kind of a theory you need at the lower level to predict that phenomenon. So you can't just use the, let's say, like the standard or like the base theory at the lowest level. You need a new theory which accounts for the effect of these higher level principles and their effect upon the lower level domain. So, does strong emergence exist at all, or is all of that just theoretical? Because you might be thinking, like, in principle, all of this makes sense, but is it actually a real thing that exists? Well, to argue for the existence of strong emergence, what I'm going to do is not at first look at reality. Instead, I'm going to look at a simpler system, a much simpler system, which is John Conway's game of life. Now, if you're not familiar with John Conway, he was a mathematician of unprecedented scope and genius, like a true revolutionary in the field of mathematics, who passed away recently. And he created this game called the Game of Life, which is a game that plays itself. And the rules are extremely simple. Here are the rules for how it works. And it basically is played on a 2x2 grid of square cells. And there are different rules for these cells, which determine whether a cell stays dead, comes to life, so it's like colored in blue here, dies, or stays the same, so it doesn't die, so it just stays where it is, it just survives. So these very basic rules dictate what happens in the next generation, and then what happens after that, and what happens after that. So it's a game that entirely plays itself. And yet, despite the simplicity of these rules, you can get extremely complicated behavior. So just look at all of this craziness that's happening right here. All of this is being facilitated by very, very simple fundamental rules. So you can think of those fundamental rules as being analogous to the fundamental particles and the way they behave. And then these emergent behaviors or emergent phenomena are examples of emergence. Now, are all of these examples just examples of weak emergence, or are any of these examples of strong emergence? Well, the researcher Thomas Schmickel attempted to answer this question. And what he found is that predictions of emergent phenomena appearing on the macroscopic layer of a complex system can fail if they are made by a microscopic model. Okay, this study demonstrates and analyzes this claim on a well-known complex system, Conway's Game of Life. This suggests that some macroscopic system properties in a complex dynamic system should be interpreted as examples of phenomena properties arising from strong emergence, due to the lack of ability to build a consistent micro to macro model that could explain these phenomena in a before-the-fact way. So, what he's saying is that there are phenomena in the game of life where if you try to predict their behavior just from these basic rules, you're going to get the wrong answer. It actually is not capable of predicting what's going to happen. You can get the right answer if you make a macroscopic model, by which he means you take into account laws occurring on the higher level. So remember that we talked about this, that these phenomena introduce brand new laws into the system. And if you account for these laws, you can predict what's going to happen. But if you exclusively use these lower level laws, you can't predict what's going to happen. And so this is rather remarkable. It's showing that strong emergence can exist in the game of life. So to quote him further regarding strong emergence, these are emergent phenomena or system properties which cannot be explained post hoc and predicted a priori by a consistent model chain of micro to macro causations from the underlying microscopic mechanisms. This is, for example, the case when the emergent phenomenon on the macroscopic system level feeds back to the microscopic components and modulates their behavior. This way, a closed loop of micro, macro, micro causation arises. So what this is essentially saying is that these larger phenomena, so you see several examples of these larger phenomena on the screen, they seem to have some kind of effect upon the fundamental components out of which they are made. And this effect means that you can't use the base laws to figure out how these systems will behave. You need to account for the effect that these higher level systems are having upon the lower level domain. This makes it impossible to predict these behaviors just from the lower level domain. You can only do so in a post hoc way. So after you observe them, then you can figure out what kind of a model you need to explain this kind of behavior, but you couldn't do so a priori. You need to observe the phenomenon, and then you can make these predictions. So this means strong emergence has been observed in the game of life. So this is really remarkable because, again, this is a very simple system, far simpler than our own reality. It only involves particles either being alive or dead, whereas our own reality involves a huge number of particles and very complicated rules for how they interact. And nevertheless, this simple system is able to produce examples of strong emergence. Now, this isn't the only researcher to look at this. Rosas et al. Also examined strong emergence within the context of the game of life. And they did so by developing a quantitative definition of downward causation. So downward causation is really key to strong emergence. And whenever we see downward causation, we know that this must be a strongly emergent phenomenon. So because it implies that a holistic system is having a causal effect upon its parts. And so what they do is that they can identify an emergent feature. So like they can, for example, look at these particles and then apply their model to check whether it has a downward causal effect upon its constituents. So this was applied to particles in the game of life. So a particle is basically just one of these bigger structures. It's not referring to the cells, but rather these bigger structures. And by applying this model, they confirmed that particles do in fact have a downward causal effect upon individual cells. So this readily explains why it's impossible to use a micro model to predict the behavior of some systems. Not all. So there are examples of weak emergence in the game of life, and that's well established. But there are also examples of strong emergence where you can't use the basic rules to predict what's going to happen. So it's important to realize that it's not as though these systems are entirely unpredictable. They are predictable. You just need to have the right concepts at hand. You need the right variables in order to understand what kind of a law applies to these systems. And so it's not entirely unpredictable. It's just unpredictable with the pure theory, with the fundamental laws themselves. And what's interesting is that weak emergence is what's giving rise to some kind of phenomenon. And then when that phenomenon has an effect upon the components, the overall system then becomes strongly emergent. And so weak emergence and strong emergence aren't necessarily mutually incompatible. Is that the right way to put it? They can exist together, and they seem to be components of each other. Now, you might be thinking that, this is an example in the game of life, but what about reality? You might be skeptical, like, okay, maybe this is a specific case where strong emergence exists, but does reality itself produce strong emergence? Well, hopefully you should see that if the math of reality and the math that governs the fundamental constituents of reality is more complex than this, then surely it should be able to give rise to strongly emergent phenomena. Now, if you're skeptical of that, you really shouldn't be, but let's just say you are skeptical of that. The question becomes, are there any examples of strong emergence using real-life physics? Now, this is a very hard question to answer because you can imagine trying to track the behavior of every single particle in a microorganism or like even a human or something like that, and the computation just becomes enormous, and so it becomes unfeasible to even test it. But you can find real-life examples of strong emergence within the realm of physics. Now, George Ellis demonstrated this within computer transistors, which is a very interesting example because we're the ones who design transistors, and so we can study them more easily than studying a living system. And so because of the fact that we were the ones to design transistors, it gives us the ability to study whether transistors are strongly emergent. Now, transistors consist of several emergent levels, starting with electron dynamics at the lowest level and emerging into digital logic. Now, what Ellis claims is that the digital logic has a causal effect on the flow of electrons. And so the movement of electrons through the transistors is impossible to predict from fundamental physics alone. Now, how does he show this? Well, first, he starts by breaking down the different emergent levels. So he starts at level 1, which is the electrons and ions level. So this Hamiltonian is basically the equation that tells you the potential energy of electrons, i.e. everything you need to know about the individual electrons as they move. So this is like the most fundamental equation for the way electrons behave. If you go one level up, you have collections of electrons moving through circuits. And this is kind of like the electron population level. So now you think of like the overall current flow rather than like the individual electron flow. At level 3, we have the crystal structure. So crystals are different semiconductors. And again, we are the ones who have designed these semiconductors to have particular properties. And we design N-type semiconductor, which is doped with boron. So we inject boron into silicon, and then P-type, which is when you inject phosphorus into silicon, and you get these crystals with different properties. With different ability to conduct electricity or stop the flow of electricity being conducted. So that's why they're called semiconductors. And so at this level, we're already starting to see new properties emerge from the crystal structure alone. Now you can take these crystals and combine them into something called a transistor. This is where you take N-doped and P-doped semiconductor, and then what you can do is if you conduct electricity near the semiconductor, it can allow the flow of electricity. So basically, you've created a switch that can allow or inhibit the flow of electricity through the semiconductor. So you can turn this switch on and off very quickly, and that's what a transistor is. So again, this is another emergent level because the transistor is composed of several subcomponents, which acting together starts to have new properties, i.e. the property of being able to control the flow of electricity using electricity. Now you can combine these transistors to get gates. Now these are logic gates. Now interestingly, the design of these gates is such that they carry out logical operations. So hopefully you're familiar with logic gates and the logical operations that they can perform. But just to give you an example, an AND gate is composed of two transistors, so two of these transistors connected to each other in series. And so electricity only flows if both of them are on. So that gives you the logical operation of and then you can get different logical operations. And so what you've done is you've forced electricity to perform logic for you, and just by the way you've designed these transistors. And then you can go one level higher, which is digital logic, which is when you take a bunch of these logic gates and combine them to answer very specific logical questions. And again, these are emergent from those smaller logic gates. So the question we ask is, does level 1 predict level 6? So if I just used this electron Hamiltonian, would I be able to predict the way the electricity moves through these transistors? Through these logic gates? And the answer is no. The behavior of electrons is not determined solely by fundamental physics. And you can show this mathematically. And if you want to check out the original paper to see the mathematics behind it, I'm not going to get into it because that's not really the focus of what's going on here. But the math is all there. And what it shows is that a new term must be added to the Hamiltonian to get the voltage at the gate contact. Okay, so this term, it will tell you if electricity will flow or not, but it cannot be derived in a bottom-up way. Rather, it gets applied in a top-down way. By this, I mean is that you observe that effect and then you add that new term to your Hamiltonian. There's no way to use the Hamiltonian itself to predict that effect. So this actually results in a new equation, and this new equation can be used to predict the movement of electrons through the transistors. So you might be thinking, well, if you have an equation that can predict the behavior of transistors, then this is weak emergence. No. Well, not really, because this new equation can only be derived through our knowledge of the higher level dynamics. And so it can't be predicted from lower level laws. So what this basically implies is that the design of these logic gates and the way that we've designed them has introduced this new kind of variable that is affecting the way the electrons flow. And so this is what we mean by downward causation. This new structure that we've created is having an effect upon the fundamental physics, such that the fundamental physics itself is insufficient for telling you how the system will behave. So this is mathematical proof that strong emergence is real, and we didn't even need to try to predict the behavior of a living system with the standard model Lagrangian. We can just show this in something as simple as a transistor. But let's think about some of the staggering implications of this. This implies that abstract logic. So remember, those logic gates are designed to express logical statements, and logic itself can alter electron dynamics. The structure of these logical statements themselves is determining how electrons move. And you have to think, what is logic? Logic is this kind of abstract thing that we've created. We represent logic using the logic gates, but it's still an abstract notion that we've imposed upon the way electricity is moving. And so electricity is moving in accordance with logic. Logic is having this effect upon electricity so that the electricity has to obey logical laws and logical statements rather than just the laws of electricity. It still obviously obeys the laws of electricity, but now it needs to also obey the laws of logic. And so we've shown that this abstract entity is having a downward effect upon electricity. And again, the original equation must be altered so that it accounts for the complicated mechanisms taking place. So the crystal structures and the phonons which arise from the crystal structure, all of that is having a downward effect upon the electricity, such that the electron dynamics are altered. And again, the source of this alteration is abstract logic, so the logic must be having a downward causal effect on fundamental physics. We conclude, therefore, that transistors are strongly emergent, that there's no way to predict the behavior of transistors solely from the bottom level. You need to account for what's going on at higher levels, i.e. the crystal structure, i.e. the logic, in order to predict what's going to happen. And if you account for all of that, you can predict what's going to happen. But the lower level itself is insufficient. Now, anybody who works with computers should know that computers consist of like a huge number of emergent levels. At the lower level, we have transistors, but it goes up to digital logic, to microarchitecture, to CPU architecture, machine code, assembly language, compilers and interpreters, and high-level code. And these emergent levels are also examples of strong emergence because that high-level code that you write using Python or Java or whatever, it is having an effect on the way the transistors are behaving, which in turn has an effect upon the way the electricity is behaving. So your higher level code, which you write into your computer, can chain down through these emergent levels all the way down to the transistor level to affect transistors, which is really remarkable and a really obvious case of strong emergence because the higher level code is determining how the transistors behave. And so anybody who works with computers is directly in contact with an example of downward causation. And so it's a rather trivial fact that emergence exists in computers. But it's also very remarkable that we've created these devices that are so strongly emergent that we need like a brand new field of science called computer science in order to understand them. And you'll see that that's kind of a theme in strong emergence. So again, what we're showing is that it's possible to force electrons to do math. Math is not something that electrons do of their own nature, but computers can force them to do math, and the code that we write can force them to do math. Of course, our code doesn't have to be necessarily math, but you can make your code force the electrons to do things that they don't ordinarily do. And then it chains back up. So again, it's not just downward causation, it's also upward causation. So the electrons do what they do, and then they cause this chain back up all the way back to your code level. So whatever output you get from the code is like the effect that the electrons have upon the code, and then it goes back down again. So your code can affect the electricity can affect the codes. It's both ways. It's not just one way. It's not just downward causation. It's downward and upward causation. And again, we shouldn't be surprised that a computer is strongly emergent. Just look what it's capable of doing. Like you're watching this video right now because of your computer, whether your phone or your TV or laptop. And something like that is very remarkable. And yet it's all being facilitated by a strongly emergent device. Now, I want to quote Anthony Leggett, who has a very interesting perspective, because he's even shown that many of the things that we know about in physics appear also to be examples of strong emergence, where you can't predict, you can't derive their properties just in a bottom-up way. So I'll quote him here. No significant advance in the theory of matter in bulk has ever come about through derivation from microscopic principles. I would confidently argue further that it is in principle and forever impossible to carry out such a derivation. The so-called derivations of the results of solid-state physics from microscopic principles alone are almost all bogus. If derivation is meant to have anything like its usual sense. Consider as elementary a principle as Ohm's law. As far as I know, no one has ever come even remotely within reach of deriving Ohm's law from microscopic principles without a whole host of auxiliary assumptions, physical approximations, which one almost certainly would not have thought of making unless one knew in advance the result one wanted to get, and some of which may be regarded as essentially begging the question. So what he's saying here is that a lot of physicists claim that fundamental physics can explain everything and that we don't need anything else. But what this is showing is that a lot of the derivations that we get for certain principles, such as Ohm's law is a very elementary principle in electricity. If you're an electrician or you work with electricity, you should be familiar with Ohm's law. And yet nobody's been able to derive it just from fundamental physics. You can derive it if you make some assumptions, but those assumptions are evidence of downward causation. Those assumptions are evidence that some kind of macroscopic effect is applied to the fundamental laws, and then once you know what that macroscopic effect is, you can derive the proper law. And so, very elementary examples of these of strong emergence appear to exist in physics. So with that established, I want to ask the question, what does it mean for the universe to be capable of producing strongly emergent phenomena? Because there are a whole host of implications, and a lot of them are rather staggering. And I hope you'll sit with me to unpack some of these. So what it's implying is essentially the whole is not equivalent to the sum of the parts. And certain holistic entities have brand new properties, brand new unforeseen properties that explain why our universe can be so complex and so filled with such distinct phenomena. We can't really reduce everything to fundamental physics. Now, through emergence, we have different kind of domains of knowledge. So, for example, culture, life, mind, matter. These different domains of existence come into existence because of emergence. But it's important to realize that because of strong emergence and because of the new properties and new concepts that exist at each of these levels, you can't reduce all of this to physics. Each thing occupies its own domain of knowledge, which involves rules or concepts which simply don't apply at the lower level. A great example is life. So we talked earlier about how you can take a bunch of different molecules and arrange them to get something that's living. So the concept of life applies to a cell, but it doesn't apply to the individual molecules out of which a cell is made. So we have this concept which applies to the whole, but it doesn't apply to the parts. The parts, as far as we can tell, are neutral. They're not alive. They're not living. And yet the whole thing together somehow is alive. So some kind of concept applies to the whole, which doesn't apply to the parts. This also implies that there's no such thing as a theory of everything. Physicists who work in fundamental theory are obsessed with this notion of like a theory of everything. And physicists are spending a huge amount of time trying to uncover a theory of everything. But what we've shown is that there cannot be a theory of everything. It just doesn't exist in principle. We can have a theory that explains everything at the lowest level, but through emergence, new things will come into existence, and we can't explain those things through the fundamental physics. Each new phenomenon has new properties, and entirely new concepts are needed to understand these phenomena. And this also explains the emergence of complexity, because if the universe had to work with just the fundamental laws, we shouldn't expect the universe to be particularly complex. But if at each level of the emergent chain, new properties are introduced, this can explain why things get so complicated. And we should be perplexed at the complexity of life, for example. Like, just think about how many different types of organisms there are, and think about the complexity of like consciousness, and think about, the complexity of society, of human societies. These things are enormously complicated systems, and so we shouldn't expect them to be entirely reducible to fundamental physics. Now, we've been talking about like very mathematical versions of emergence, but there are some examples of strong emergence which are very easy to understand. So what I have here is a diagram that kind of shows the nature of causality. So according to George Ellis, causality is always horizontal, whereas emergence is upwards and realization is downwards. But we can substitute the word realization with downward causation because it kind of helps us a little bit. But there are different domains. So you can have like the lowest level of reality, and you can pick whichever you want to be your lowest level, and then observe emergent phenomena with respect to that level. And then that phenomenon can have a downward causal effect upon the level which gave rise to it, indicating strong emergence. But that level, the medium level in this case, can also, through emergence, give rise to even higher level domains. So what's an example of this? So we start at the level of your genes, so your genetics. That gives rise to you, the individual. But then you, as an individual, you are a unit, a smaller unit, in a bigger system called a society. So through emergence, we have these three different levels of existence. We have the gene level, the individual level, and the societal level. But then each of these levels can affect each other. So it's not just that your genes give rise to you and then you give rise to society. Society can also have a downward causal effect upon you. So what's a good example of this? Well, depending on the society you live in, it determines the language you speak. It determines the accent with which you speak that language. It determines your culture, your values, the clothes that you wear, the religion that you partake in. All of these things are societally determined. So society as this holistic system is having an effect upon the individual. And that's pretty obvious. But at the same time, the individual has an effect upon society. You can choose to wear different clothes, and that might affect your society's fashion sense. At the same time, your society can have an effect upon your genetics through epigenetic mechanisms. So epigenetic mechanisms are ways in which your DNA changes throughout your life by restricting certain parts of the DNA and various mechanisms like that. So your society can have an effect on your DNA, and you can have an effect on your DNA. Your behavior can alter your DNA. And Dennis Noble has done a lot of work to show how this works. A lot of people don't believe that this is a thing, but it is. And I'd be curious to see what Charles Darwin would have thought of all of this. So hopefully this shows that the idea of strong emergence is actually rather trivial, and there are very simple examples of strong emergence, which are rather obvious and easy to understand. And anybody who works in biology, sociology or psychology, it should be pretty evident that strong emergence is a trivial fact. It's just a fact that there are different emergent levels that all have causation to each other. Where it's not trivial is in the realm of physics, where we have fundamental physicists who work with fundamental theory, believing that their kind of field of science takes precedent and is privileged over all other sciences, and all other sciences are just bad versions or incomplete versions of physics. But what this is showing is that each domain of science is legitimate and occupies its legitimate domain of knowledge, and you can't just do biology by doing physics. You can't just do sociology or economics by doing physics, because each of these domains has its own rules, which aren't implied by physics at all. Now, I want to talk about a very interesting example of strong emergence, which is DNA, and the way DNA moves, the way DNA evolves over time, is actually strongly emergent. Now, I got some feedback from last time that this was kind of hard to understand. How could DNA be strongly emergent if you can just see its physical structure? Well, there are a lot of reasons why DNA is a strongly emergent phenomenon. Even though it has a physical structure and we can, clearly see what that physical structure is, the way DNA behaves and some of the properties of DNA must be strongly emergent. For example, the fact that DNA encodes information is an indication that it must be strongly emergent. And I'll get into that a little bit more. Okay, let's talk about a few things. So, for example, DNA is subject to evolution by natural selection. And evolution by natural selection determines the structure of DNA. But evolution is not a thing, it's a process, right? So it has the characteristics of a process rather than being a physical structure. So it shows that this process, which again exists at a kind of higher level because it depends on the survival of the organism, that itself must be a downward causal effect upon DNA. And it's determining which DNA survives. So this is a downward causal effect, but also the fact that DNA is subject to random mutations. This means that it's subject to stochastic processes. DNA is an example of an entity that utilizes or harnesses stochastic processes. Now, whenever we have a kind of stochastic process in combination with a deterministic process, it shows that you can't use fundamental physics to predict how this is going to evolve into the future, because it involves both randomness and determinism. And the randomness means that you can't use pure determinism, and the determinism means that you can't use pure randomness. So the combination of these two things is also another way to show a strongly emergent phenomena. And what this also shows is that different strongly emergent phenomena can be very different from each other, and have different kind of properties. And so you should realize that you can't reduce all strongly emergent phenomena to having the same properties. There are different emergent phenomena, strongly emergent phenomena, can be vastly different from each other and have completely different parallel properties. Now, DNA evolves over time, which again isn't a physics concept, it's a biology concept. Atoms themselves are not subject to evolution by natural selection, but DNA is. So another thing, which I mentioned before, is that DNA involves encoding, and the structure itself is what is preserved over time. The information in the code. So not the particular molecules itself, but the information. And so the information itself must be something over and beyond the molecules, because basically, when an organism reproduces, it passes on its information. It doesn't pass on the specific molecules of DNA which gave rise to it. It passes on the information in the form of an identical copy of that DNA. So the fact that you can get the same information with a different strand of DNA shows that the information must be something over and above the molecule itself. And again, it's because the information is surviving. And so the information expressed by DNA is itself an emergent phenomena, which arises from DNA. And you should regard information as real, as a really existing phenomenon, as a real existent entity, which affects the DNA, which has a downward causal effect upon the DNA. Now, that's all complicated to explain, and there are a lot of books that explain this in more detail, one of which, or actually two of which, were written by Dennis Noble, who has done a lot of work to demonstrate the nature of emergence and downward causation in biological systems. So he speaks often against the idea of genetic determinism, which is preached by somebody like Richard Dawkins, who preaches genetic determinism and genetic reductionism. The selfish gene theory. But this theory is incorrect, because genes don't merely influence biology in an upwards way. Biology also influences genes. So the organism themselves can influence their own genetics. So genetics isn't a fundamental level which all biology can be reduced to, because the DNA itself and genetics itself is influenced by biological systems. And there are lots of examples of this. For example, the epigenetic mechanisms that we talked about earlier, as well as the fact that genes can't work in isolation. They work in big networks. And so those networks, those gene networks, are themselves holistic entities. And so you can't just look at individual genes to figure out what's going to happen. You need to account for all of the genes working together in harmony. So again, that's an example of like a holistic system having an effect upon the individual parts. Now, Noble talks about his principle of biological relativity, which means that there is no privileged level of causation. So all of the different levels of causation in biology are all relevant, and you can't just say that it's the genes that determine everything. It's various systems that all have an impact upon the destiny of the biological organism. Now, like I said before, new concepts in biology arise that have no equivalent in fundamental physics. So, for example, evolution by natural selection, there is no physics concept which is evolution by natural selection. It's purely a biological concept. It exists in the context of biology, but it doesn't apply to fundamental physics. So that's why we need a concept of evolution by natural selection in biology, and why that principle isn't implied by fundamental physics itself. And so this is what we mean by life having new properties, which physics doesn't have, or which fundamental physics doesn't have. Evolution by natural selection is a good example. And the fact that, living organisms perceive their environments, they occupy specific niches, they reproduce, they interact with other biological systems. They're all engaging in behavior, which is not reducible to physics. So something like, for example, predation and metabolism, like all of that applies to life, but it doesn't apply to individual particles. A good example of this is death. Living things, first of all, they're alive, which also isn't a physics concept, but they're also subject to death. And are particles themselves subject to death? Is it possible to kill a particle? No, but it is possible to kill a living organism. So the concept of death applies to certain phenomena, but not to the constituent parts of those phenomena. So this is what we mean, that there has to be new concepts in biology. The concept of reproduction, again, it's not a concept that you see in physics itself, but it does make sense in life. Life itself is also subject to downward causal effects from the environment. So the environment can influence a living system in a holistic way. So that's another example of a downward effect. So even though life is a strongly emergent phenomena, it's also affected by even more strongly emergent phenomena in the form of the environment, or like the biosphere, or like the ecosystem. These are also examples of holistic phenomena which can affect the trajectory of life, and affect things like evolution and which organisms survive, and the evolution of new traits and new properties and new behaviors. It also gives rise to things like intelligence. Intelligence, again, is a new thing that exists in the universe. It gives rise to teleology, so purpose. So purpose, again, is not something that exists in physics, but it exists in life. Living organisms are driven by purpose, the purpose to survive, the purpose to reproduce. And so if you don't account for that purpose, there's no way you can use fundamental physics to predict the behavior of a living system, because there's no Lagrangian for the concept of purpose. You have to account for purpose at a higher level in order to understand the behavior of a biological system, and it's kind of foolish to think you can reduce all of this to fundamental physics. Now, my favorite example of emergence, because I work in psychology, is of that of consciousness, that of sentience, of qualia, perceptions, sensations, emotions, thoughts, your inner monologue, your ability to imagine things with your mind's eye. These are all mental, and they appear to be taking place in a realm beyond the physical. Now, it's my belief that all of this arises from matter. It arises from the complex neuronal activity of the brain, but consciousness itself is not physical. Consciousness itself arises through physics, but it itself is not physical. Like if you close your eyes and just like listen to your own internal monologue, that internal monologue, again, it's involving these physical processes happening in your brain, but the monologue itself is non-physical. And so the complicated nervous system that you possess is giving rise to a new kind of phenomenon, which is beyond matter. Now, consciousness is often put forth as like a quintessential example of strong emergence, because we have the hard problem of consciousness, which is that it's impossible in principle to understand how any arrangement of matter can give rise to experience. The fact that it feels like something to be a person, there's no way to explain that purely in terms of matter. Now, regardless of whether you can explain it or not, what this is showing is that there are new phenomena, non-physical phenomena, arising from physical processes. And so consciousness does exist. Consciousness is non-physical. And so new kinds of phenomena that transcend the physical universe are existing as a result of emergence. And so what's very interesting as well is that it's very often posited by physicalists that consciousness is like an epiphenomenon, that it itself does not have causal efficacy because it's not physical. It's just kind of like a byproduct. But this has to be wrong. Consciousness itself must have physical efficacy despite not being physical. We know this for sure because, for example, you can use your consciousness to move your body. So you can move your finger, you can swivel around in your chair like I'm doing right now because your consciousness is having a downward causal effect upon the matter in your body. Something which exists at a higher level is influencing you at a lower level. And there are lots of great examples of consciousness affecting the matter in your body. Excuse me. A great example is pain. So pain is a subjective experience, a qualia. It's non-physical. Yet pain can cause your body to move. So if you touch like a hot stove, the pain causes your hand to move very quickly. And it's the non-physical pain which is influencing your body in a downward way to cause that to happen. Now, some people think that like you can explain that purely mechanistically. And I would say that you actually can't explain it purely mechanistically. You have to account for the subjective experience of pain to account for that. Because there are some people who can't experience pain while all of the physical stuff is still happening, and they don't move their hands whenever they experience pain. And so the subjective experience must be a causal influence in somebody moving their hand away from a hot stove. Another great example would be like anything creative. So like technology, for example. Anything you create with your mind, it exists in a kind of abstract space inside your head. So if you come up with like an idea for a brand new technology, it first exists as like an abstract entity inside your own mind. And then you can cause the matter in your body to move in such a way that this abstract entity comes into existence. So something that was abstract has now become physical, become real, thanks to your consciousness and thanks to your consciousness's ability to move the matter in your body in a downward causal way. So consciousness must itself have causal efficacy, and there's lots of evidence that this is the case, even though a lot of people seem to deny this. Now, again, a lot of this is quite trivial because it's hard to imagine the behavior of a human being being reducible to the behavior of its constituent particles because we do lots of things which particles themselves aren't capable of. Are particles individually capable of creativity, of romance, of sexual attraction, of romantic attraction, of ambition, like the ambition to be the best drummer or the best the best athlete? Like, are particles themselves subject to any of these principles? No, but something about the holistic system of a human being is subject to these principles. And so in order to account for human behavior, you need to be aware of the new properties which humans possess, things like creativity, things like ambition, things like sexual attraction. In order to account for human behavior, you need to account for all of these things. So what about something like economics? I've actually seen some physicalists claim that you could actually predict economics just with fundamental physics, but hopefully you're starting to see the problem, that economics involves lots of things which don't apply to fundamental physics. So for example, money is made of matter. There's no problem there, but you can't use the laws of matter to predict the behavior of money because money is subject to subjective value. So we look at these entities, and our human minds, our human subjectivity imposes the concept of value upon them, which means that their behavior is now going to be dictated not just by their weight and their mass and their momentum or whatever, but also by the fact that humans subjectively value these entities. And so we want them, we exchange them for goods and services. And so those concepts themselves show that the movement of money through the financial system can't be tracked with physics. That just doesn't make sense. That's just completely ridiculous. Which is why we need a new field of science called economics in order to predict the movement of money. We need a new concept. We need a new field of understanding in order to account for this new, strongly emergent phenomenon that exists in our universe. And to think that you can reduce it to physics doesn't make sense for multiple reasons, especially the fact that economics entangles human subjectivity and human concepts like value, which again are not concepts which apply to individual particles, but they do apply to holistic systems of particles known as human beings. Okay. Now, I want to talk about something called multiple realizability. This was a point of confusion in the last presentation, but multiple realizability is another way to prove that something is strongly emergent. Because if a phenomenon can be realized in different ways, i.e. through different systems, through different physical systems, it must be strongly emergent. So what we have here is a water computer. So the design of this computer and of these little orange boxes is such that it behaves just like a digital computer performing logical operations, similar to those transistors that we saw earlier. So the logic that's being performed here can be realized through this water computer, and so logic itself must be strongly emergent because you can get the same behavior using different fundamental constituents. And so what this shows is that the phenomenon in question, so in this case, digital logic, can be expressed or cannot be, how do I put this? Cannot simply be reduced to the fundamental constituents. So you don't need the same constituents to get the same phenomenon. And so this shows that the phenomenon itself must be something over and beyond that physical system. You don't need that specific physical system to get the phenomenon. And so Boolean logic can be carried out by transistors, or it can be carried out by water. And so Boolean logic itself is a strongly emergent phenomenon, which can influence the behavior of its constituent parts, but you don't need the same constituent parts in order to get that phenomenon. If that was confusing, another great example would be language, okay? So here I have a whole bunch of different ways of saying the word hello, right? So the word hello, or the concept, or the meaning of the word hello, can be represented in a bunch of different forms, in different languages. Hello, hola, bonjour. All of these mean the same thing. And so they're the same phenomenon being expressed in different ways. And so the concept of meaning must itself be strongly emergent because you can get you can get the same phenomenon with different representations of that phenomenon. So it's not possible to reduce the phenomenon just to the specific form, because you can get different forms and get the same phenomenon, if that makes sense. Language is a great example of strong emergence. And there's so much about language that shows that it's strongly emergent, that it can't be reduced to kind of like any fundamental level. Like, is it possible to reduce a word to its individual letters, to its individual phonemes? Like, no, like it's a holistic phenomenon. Like, you need all of the phonemes working together to get the specific word. And so there's lots of reasons to show that language is strongly emergent, and which is why I think language is one of the most fascinating phenomena. Another example would be like computer code. So anybody who works with code, it becomes very obvious that there are different ways to write the same code, or in other words, to get the same output using different code, using different coding languages. And that's another example of multiple realizability. But what I'm showing here is like a hypothetical example of artificial life. So life could be similar. Life could be realized in different systems. So the life that exists on Earth is all carbon-based, but it's definitely possible to produce, or it could be possible in the future to produce artificial life. And so we'll have life realized in a different system using silicon and computer chips and whatnot, and yet it is still life. It's still living. So the concept of life applies to it, even though it's realized in a completely different physical system. So that's what we mean, that the phenomenon that's being realized by these physical systems, if it doesn't depend entirely on the physical systems, it must be strongly emergent because it can be realized in a variety of different ways. That's a big topic, and I'd love to break that down more in the future. But the reason you're seeing Aristotle right now is because Aristotle appears to have predicted, or appears to have described, the phenomenon of strong emergence way before modern physicists and way before modern thinkers, because he had this concept known as the four causes, which were the material cause, which is what an object is made of, the formal cause, which is the form that it takes, the efficient cause, i.e. what sparked movement in that object to arrive at the way that it is, and the final cause, which is like the function of the object. And there's a relationship between the formal cause, the form that the object takes, and the final cause, the function, because the formal cause can influence the function that it has. And so holistic phenomena can have causal effects on physical systems. And so the form that an object takes determines its destiny, so to speak. So for example, a chair, the structure of a chair, the form that it takes, causes, in a sense, people to sit on it. I know that's a weird way to put it, but it's kind of true that the form that a chair takes influences its behavior into the future. So this is well described by Aristotle way before the modern age. And so it's not really a new idea. It's just that physicists don't seem to think, or fundamental physicists don't seem to think that it's real and that all causation is upwards. But no, that's not the case at all. A significant amount of causation can be shown to be downwards, where holistic systems together can have a downward causal effect. So what are some takeaways? Well, each field of knowledge exists at its own level and accords to laws that exist at that level. And this is arguably why the universe is so complex and why there are so many different fields of science, and why it's just mind-boggling when you look at, like, for example, the different principles that exist in biology. Spend any time like studying different species of plants or insects or even mammals, and you start to realize just how crazily complex nature is. And all of this is being facilitated by emergence, by strong emergence. And it's hard to imagine all of this occurring without strong emergence. And it also implies that there's probably a wide range of phenomena in the universe, in the external world, that we don't know about because they haven't yet emerged. And they might not ever emerge, but it's possible in the future that more examples of strongly emergent phenomena could exist. And I think the internet is like a good example of that, of like this very highly strongly emergent phenomena. And things like AI, like large language models, these appear to be like super strongly emergent phenomena that are capable of doing things that are just totally unexpected and unpredictable. And that's actually one of the things about AI, is that the way it behaves appears to be unpredictable. At least unpredictable using fundamental laws, but we should be able to predict them once we understand the more holistic principles which govern their behavior. Now, I want to end this with a quote by Cormac McCarthy from Blood Meridian. Now, this quote is meant to be like very dark and grim and kind of scary, but I also think it's just like true, and it really does speak to strong emergence and like just how perplexing the universe is and how mind-boggling it is. So he says, or the judge in Blood Meridian says, "The truth about the world is that anything is possible. Had you not seen it all from birth and thereby wedded of its strangeness, it would appear to you for what it is. A hat trick in a medicine show, a fevered dream, a trance be populate with chimeras, having neither analog nor precedent, an itinerant carnival, a migratory tent show whose ultimate destination, after many a pitch in many a muddied field, is unspeakable and calamitous beyond reckoning. The universe is no narrow thing, and the order within it is not constrained by any latitude in its conception, to repeat what exists in one part in any other part. Even in this world, more things exist without our knowledge than with it, and the order in creation which you see is that which you have put there, like a string in a maze, so that you shall not lose your way. For existence has its own order, and that no man's mind can compass, that mind itself being but a fact among others." So again, I think not everything about this quote speaks to reality, but I think that a lot of it does. And this should just really stun you with how crazy the universe is and how mind-blowing it is. And you can hear my dog barking, which is my cue to go soon. But yeah, here are the references. Please check them out. They'll also be in the description. And yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.